In high school, I took part in something I would live to greatly regret. Although I never thought of myself as a mean girl, I see now that I wasn't all that far off from it. I had a small group of female friends, and we all thought we were the coolest of the cool. We didn't fit in any other group per se, but we were closest with the preppy people. More than one of us dated football players, and we became pretty popular by default. It was a very vapid and empty life in retrospect, but in my 16-year-old mind, I was among the elite of the school. On the other end of the spectrum was Dwight. He was everything you think of when you hear the term neckbeard. His bathing habits were almost non-existent. He had an overblown sense of intelligence, too, that made him quite a lot of enemies. Most, if not all the students I knew, couldn't stand the guy. One day during algebra class, a few of us came up with a funny trick to play on him. It was quite cruel, but we believed that he deserved it because he annoyed everyone so much. I really was a stupid girl back then. The plan was this. We would write anonymous love letters and drop them off in Dwight's locker. If it all worked out, he would believe he had a secret admirer and make a fool out of himself. The end of the plan was something you'll have to wait a little longer to hear. The same day, me and my girls got together at lunch and wrote the first letter. We drew straws to decide who would deliver it, and I came up short. I waited until class started and slipped out to use the restroom. That was when I dropped it in his locker. Over the next few weeks, we'd continue with those letters. Soon enough, news reached us of Dwight's new secret love. He had been bragging about her before school, told us all firsthand how sexy she must be, among all the things he wished to do to her. The urge to laugh in his face was almost unbearable, but none of us gave the game away until the time was right, and that time came 2 weeks later. The lunchroom would be the place to spring our trap. Homecoming was coming up, and we decided to use that to our advantage. His secret admirer was now ready to show herself, and she wanted him to ask her to the dance. Just to make things that much crueler, we told him to bring a rose with him when they met. When the day came, we told all our friends about our plan. About 20 or so of us hid around a corner until he showed up. He arrived right on schedule, rose in hand, but nobody was there to meet him. He began looking around nervously, and then we all popped out and began laughing. The whole lunchroom was staring as we pointed and mocked him. His face turned bright red, and he looked as if he was about to begin crying. He ran off at this point. I can't say if he actually broke down or not. It's the thing I'm most ashamed of doing. After our horribly cruel joke was done, we went on to do other things, all but forgetting about Dwight. Actually, I remember not seeing him around for quite a few days after that. Not that I blame him if he wanted to lay low for a while. The homecoming came and went, and then the actual scary stuff began happening. The first experience was mild compared to some later things. Our house got TP'd just before a big rainstorm. It took 2 weeks to get all the paper out of the trees and bushes. A similar thing happened to my friend Stormy as well. Things only grew more serious from there. Another close friend of mine had a fire started in her front yard. All the windshield wipers on my car were ripped off at one point, and the windows were smashed in. Stormy's brand new birthday present, a big red Mustang, was keyed up and down both sides and similarly smashed about. I had all 4 of my tires slashed at one point. We had nothing to give to the police or to our parents. The truth is, we made a lot of people mad, and we couldn't prove it was anyone in particular over the other. One final thing would cause us to finally break though. One week around 2 a.m., I felt a presence outside which woke me up. A loud crash suddenly came through my window. I leapt out of bed in fright to see glass all over the floor. I couldn't see what caused it until I turned on my overhead light. Stuck on the tip of my bed was a brick with a letter attached to it. Before I could even read it, my mother started banging on my door. I was unsure what it said, so I ripped it off the brick and stuck it in my pocket prior to letting my mom in. She did her usual thing of being overdramatic whilst I cleaned up all the glass myself. Things blew over though, and she quickly went back to bed. I did a temporary patch on the window and crawled back in myself. Only then did I unfold the note. Scrawled in black ink, read these simple words: "Say you're sorry, or else." The next day at school, I showed it to the other two girls. We weren't positive it was Dwight doing all this, but we were desperate. We were all really scared, and we wanted this to be over. We waited until we saw him at his locker and confronted him about the note. He had this calm, strange look in his eyes. He took a quick glance at us and said something to the effect of, "Well, I don't know anything about that, but maybe you should start apologizing to all the people you've screwed over. Maybe that terrible stuff might stop happening to you." And that was just what we planned after that, and just what we did as well. One by one, each of us who had been attacked told all our victims we were sorry. I can't say every single apology was straight from the heart or anything, but we still did it. More than a few people told us to screw off, but we understood. A funny thing happened after doing that too. I began to feel a little better about myself. I'd been insecure my whole life, and this made me start to make the effort to be a lot kinder to people. By graduation, I'd befriended several of those I once openly mocked. It cost me a few of my old friends, sure, but those weren't the kind of people I'd miss very much anyway. Because of that one cruel joke and everything that happened, I actually became a far better person than I was when it first started. After all these years though, one little question remains. Was it Dwight who did all those things to us? He was at our 10-year class reunion, and I even considered asking him. In the end, I didn't want to make him feel bad by dredging all that up though, so I didn't end up doing so. It is the most probable answer. Maybe all our victims played their own part, a bit of a Murder on the Orient Express sort of thing, if you will. I was terrified, and I don't believe in using violence to get what you want, but I will say one thing. It was truly an effective style of revenge on anyone, and you don't want someone like that as your enemy. This happened back in 2015 in my hometown, Ventura, California. It's a relatively small beach town, about an hour north of Los Angeles. I grew up there, and as the years have gone by, the crime has gotten worse. The comfortability factor has also decreased, while the homeless population has skyrocketed. For reference, I'm 22, and I'm a relatively small-statured woman with a very petite frame. My 8-year-old brother could pick me up if he wanted to, and I'm commonly mistaken for being somewhere around 15 or 16. To be completely honest though, it works in my favor somewhat to ward off creepy guys who are deterred by the thought of pursuing a minor. The real gross part is when the young age actually doesn't turn them off though. I worked at a bar in the downtown area of my city, and I really liked my job. I mainly just picked up empty glasses and wiped down the tables between customers, so I didn't have much contact with whoever came in. Every now and then, a drunk guy would try to hit on me, but they would usually give up when they realized I had zero interest and paid no attention to them. We'd also occasionally have bar fights where people got too drunk to handle a bad joke, or women would get into those cat fights with their so-called friends. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened this night though. It's something I'll never forget, and the reason I'll never work in a bar ever again. This specific night was my first time working the late shift. I came in at around 8 p.m. Everything was pretty normal for most of the night. That is, until about 2 a.m. when a man came in dressed in torn-up clothing, already reeking of alcohol. Usually, the bar won't serve a man who's already drunk, but our bartender was new, and he felt bad for this guy. Everybody inside did pretty much. He looked completely disheveled, and you could tell there was a 99% chance he was homeless. He looked around 40, so when he ordered his drink, no one asked him for an ID. For the next hour or so, though, I could feel the man's eyes burning into me, and I mean I could really feel them. Whenever I was out in the bar, he would stare at me without even blinking. He wouldn't even look away when I looked straight at him. From the moment I stepped foot in the bar to the moment I re-entered the kitchen, his eyes were glued to me. I got the feeling that he probably stared at the door even, waiting for me to come out for as long as I was in the back. I had noticed he had around 4 or 5 empty glasses sitting next to him, so I walked over to collect them. That's when he grabbed my wrist real hard. "How old are you, honey?" I was caught off guard, as no one had ever put their hands on me while I was working before. I didn't feel like dealing with this drunk man, so I quickly replied as I tugged away, "I'm old enough to be working here." He didn't seem to like that answer though. He yelled after me while jumping out of his chair, "That's not an answer. Tell me right now." The last part of what he said he yelled so loudly, it actually made me stop in my tracks and get kind of scared. I looked at the bartender with wide eyes, hoping he would see my fear and get this guy out of the bar as quick as possible. Our bartender was not a small guy. He was around 6'5" and clearly went to the gym, so when he saw the genuine terror on my face, it only took him a few seconds to get around the bar and escort the man out. The rest of the night went by normally, and was so uneventful I almost forgot all about that creepy strange man from earlier. Almost. My shift ended at 4 a.m., and at that point I was completely exhausted. It was still in the back of my head what happened a couple hours before, but it never occurred to me the man would be waiting outside the bar a whole 2 hours later. But he was. I stepped out of our building into the darkness of the night and began walking down the street toward the bus stop. I was too poor to afford a car, and I didn't mind taking the bus since I only lived 10 minutes away and the bus was cheap. I noticed the man following me as I got closer to the stop, but he never got close enough for me to make out his face or what he really looked like. I wasn't too worried yet. There was still a good distance between us, and I'd be hopping on the bus soon anyway. Except that wasn't going to happen. When I reached the bus stop, the words there almost made me pee my pants. Bus hours 6:30 to 8 p.m. See, it never occurred to me that the bus would no longer be running by the time I got off work. I usually got off around 7, but tonight I was a little bit late. I guess I was so excited for the better pay that I completely forgot to account for the transportation hours. I didn't live too far away, probably a 15-minute walk, but now I had someone following behind me. I stood there at the bus stop and took a deep breath, deciding to call my roommate to come pick me up, praying he would answer my call even at 4 in the morning. It rang, and he never picked up. I gathered myself up and started walking in the direction of my apartment. I hoped the guy who had been following me might have given up by then, but he hadn't gone anywhere. For every step I took, he would take 2, and the large gap we once had between us became only around 10 to 15 feet. I was completely panicking. I picked up the pace to try and get further away from him, but that only made him walk faster behind me. By the time I turned the corner to the street of my apartment, I was in an all-out sprint trying to outrun this guy. I had my keys in my hand, ready to unlock the door and get inside as soon as possible. I ran up the stairs to the 2nd floor. I could hear footsteps pounding up the steps behind me. I shoved my keys in the lock so fast, and within seconds I was inside with the door locked behind me. I was out of breath and in pure shock as to what was happening. I heard a loud thud against my door as it vibrated. I quickly realized it was the impact of the man charging at my door with full force. Around 5 minutes of silence later, which felt like forever, I decided to look out the peephole to see if he was still there. I let out a scream of terror when I saw who it was. It was the man who'd grabbed me earlier at the bar, standing in front of the door completely still, staring in through the peephole and staring at me. He had this scary smirk on his face too, as he stood there completely still, making no sound at all. I ran to my roommate's room to wake him up, to maybe deal with the guy, even just to make it so I didn't have to be alone right now. But when I opened the door, he was not there. I sunk to the floor in defeat and started to cry and shake from all the emotions I was feeling. That's when I began to hear scratching coming from the door. It lasted for what seemed like hours. I reached into my bag to grab my phone to call the police, but it wasn't there. My heart sank again. I realized it must have fallen out while I was running for my life away from this insane man. I'd never wanted a landline so much as in that moment of my life. At this point, though, there was nothing that could be done. I was not moving from that spot until my roommate came back, and I knew this man was gone. Sometime during the morning, I must have fallen asleep finally, because I was woken up by my roommate shaking me awake, asking what happened and why I was sleeping on the floor. I explained everything to him, and when I was finished, he looked at me with wide eyes and told me there was something on the door I needed to see. Carved into the door's wood with what I assume was a knife was something that still scares me to this day. We called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do because there was no way of knowing the man's identity. A basic description of a homeless man wasn't enough to go off of. They even had the audacity to tell us to just move if we were that worried about it. It's insane how incredibly unhelpful they were. I never did find my phone, and I quit my job at the bar that same day. They're obviously aware of his likeness now, and I hope they know to call the police if that man ever appears at the bar again. I never went back to that particular bar. I've since moved out of that apartment as well, and now just work from home, so I never have to experience an insanely terrifying night like that ever again. I won't lie, I got caught up in the romance of everything. I've been single too long, and because of that, my barriers were down. This guy said all the right things, and the roses certainly didn't hurt his case. I fell in love with the idea of a mysterious and handsome stranger wanting me and only me. Had everything stopped right there, I would have been disappointed, but at least I'd be left with the beautiful fantasy of it all. Things did not stop there, though. I allowed myself to hope that me and this stranger could be together one day. Until then, I'd write to him about all the plans I had for myself after the restrictions were lifted. He was tolerant of this initially, but his letters soon became more and more demanding. Who I could see, where I could go. Despite my reservations, I was so lonely I agreed to all these rules. After all, he was just looking out for my best interests, I guess, and it was just all make-believe anyway, right? Our correspondence continued, and when talk of restrictions being lifted came to light, I was contacted by my former boss and asked to return to work. I readily accepted and wrote my admirer to share the good news. To my surprise, he was anything but pleased though. According to him, this was a violation of our agreement. I was confused. How did he expect me to survive then? All the benefits I'd been receiving because of it would soon end, and I had no other choice but to wait tables again. My reasoning, though, no matter how logical it was, fell on deaf ears. I only got curses and foul name-calling in return. This was a crossroads in the relationship, and for me, there was only one way to go. As the opening of public spaces got closer, I chose to end things with this secret admirer. It had been a fun time, but it was time to drop the fantasy. No matter how awful that made me feel, it was the right thing to do. I was not a kept woman, nor would I be if possible. No man, regardless of how much I loved them, was going to make that sort of ridiculous demand of me, not being able to work. Agreeing to superficial things while everyone was trapped inside their homes was one thing, but this was just ridiculous. I wrote this all down in a letter as nicely as I could and sent it out to my admirer. It didn't take long to receive his reply. I hadn't expected him to be happy, of course, but what he wrote shocked me to my core. Things had moved way past petty name-calling and minor curses. He began threatening me, not just me, but my family too. He included actual information about my parents that terrified me. Their addresses, their phone numbers, their jobs, everything. If he thought this would change my mind though, he was very wrong. All he managed to do was make me extremely angry. With all the letters in hand, I filed a report with the police. Had I had an actual name, they said it would have been enough for a restraining order even. Going through this process really drove home to me how ridiculous the situation was. Falling in love with a completely anonymous man was the height of stupidity. For all I know, it could have not even been a man. I'd never been in a mess like this. What little I could do was done. I notified a friend of everything, but I've had yet to get a reply. It's been more than 2 months, and I hope that means this person moved on. I didn't let my parents in on the threats. I didn't want to scare them. Plus, embarrassment was a strong motivation. My mother would never let me live it down, that's for sure. I haven't heard from him since. I'm gonna try to put all this behind me since I've been deprived of my life for the last 2 years. Despite wanting to use my mistakes as a warning to other girls, if I thought anyone could identify me, I wouldn't have written this. If anyone reading this, though, finds themselves in a similar situation to mine, just throw the letter away and forget about it. This is real life, not a movie. Some handsome prince isn't gonna show up out of nowhere and kiss you at the end of the story. In real life, you always get stuck with the frog.